Hi, Dan.
Hey, Bob.
How are you?
How you holding up?
Oh, I've seen better days. But let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. And this particular Wright Show is going to be on Meaning of Life TV as opposed to Blogging Heads TV. You're Dan Kaufman. You appear regularly on Meaning of Life TV. Under the Sophia rubric, that's your show about philosophy. Do you pronounce your last name Kaufman or Kaufman?
It's actually Kaufman. It's actually Kaufmann, but my father chopped one of the ends off so that the name would look less German, being Jewish as we were. Not that it helps very much.
That fooled everybody, right?
right.
They thought you were Mennonites. You know, there are Mennonites named Kaufman.
Sure, Kaufman. Look, there are no Jewish names other than Cohen and Levy. All the Jewish surnames are European names. And so you go to Germany, you find plenty of Kaufmans that are not Jews. But in the United States, a lot of these names tend to be held by Jewish people. So.
Okay. So anyway, we are going to talk a little about something some people may have heard about. Who you never know, the election.
I don't think anybody's talking about that, Bob.
You don't? Well, we're going to anyway. Now, I'm sure everyone has been pondering. We're going to talk about it, at least in large part, from a kind of a meaning of life-y perspective. And one thing I mean by that is I would like to talk about Trumpism a little bit as kind of a moral, maybe even spiritual challenge, but in any event, a moral challenge. And not unrelated to that, I want to actually start by announcing a new feature that will appear shortly on Meaning of Life TV called 60-Second Sermons. People who feel they have a sermon in them are going to be encouraged to upload it. And, you know, if it's broadly speaking compatible with our values, which are themselves pretty broad, we'll put it on the site. In fact, if people want to, I won't elaborate too much on what we mean by sermon. We don't just mean religious sermon, although people who have a faith tradition are free to talk in that context. I would imagine most of these won't be traditional religious sermons, but would have some elements of a traditional sermon. You know, could be uplifting, inspiring, could be exhortation, could be just a reflection on the wonder of it all, could be various things. But there's elaboration on that on a webpage whose URL is meaningoflife.tv/sermon-upload.
Yeah.
If people want to go there now.
Is it on the main Meaning of Life page?
There's no link right now. There will be at some point. Maybe by the time this is posted. We're taping this on a Friday. I hope to get it up on a Monday. Once the thing is officially unveiled, there will be a link to the, yes, on the site. But people can go to the URL. If they want to, they can go to the URL now and upload a sermon. But in any event, if not that, they can read about a little bit of elaboration on what we mean.
This is a solicitation to everyone in the Meaning of Life audience. It's not just the contributors, the program producers. It's not the producers of content. It's everybody.
Right. That's true. We'll be reaching out to some of the people who have been on the site and seem like the sermonizing kind, but that's right. It's ultimately this is for the people.
That's very interesting.
And we'll see. Now, the connection between that and what we're about to talk about is I am going to be doing some of these, and I would like to do some of these sermons on this issue of Trumpism as a moral and perhaps even spiritual challenge. So I wanted to talk about that a little and see if at the end of this conversation I conclude that yes, I have a few 60-second sermons in me.
Let me ask you one more thing about the new feature. Two things. One, is this a one-off or is this an ongoing thing? And how is it going to be presented? Are you just going to sort of put them up interspersedly? Or are you going to have one big video that's going to have a whole bunch of them? Is it a one-off event? Are you going to be doing it, periodically? What's your idea?
Some of this we'll figure out as we go along. It will certainly be the case that if you watch one of these, you will be presented with others to watch. I mean, there will be a place that is the 60-second sermon place. So you're like on this page, maybe you're watching one of the sermons, other recent sermons are available.
Almost like a show link, like one of the links for the shows. You click on it, it'll...
Yeah, I think it will be an actual program, but that very much that kind of thing.
Okay. Okay, very cool. Yeah.
So Anyway, so let me, I know you have some thoughts on Trump, and you wrote something on electric Agora or Agora, depending on one's pronunciation.
You know how many emails I got about the pronunciation?
Did you really? That's good.
I have people who like consulted classicists and who like played back the playback on oral speakings of the word and dictionaries. I mean, I had no idea people were so interested in the pronunciation of Greek words, but.
Well, there you go. Yeah, this came up, well, I think last time we talked in one of our earlier conversations.
But yeah, I have an essay that I just put up on about it today, and I'll put a link for it.
Okay, so so you have your take. Let me say a few things about it from my point of view. Of course, as regular viewers / listeners may be able to surmise, I'm not wildly enthusiastic about the outcome of the election. I wasn't shocked. I was tweeting, you know, like, hold on, folks. Brexit polls were off by 4 points, which, by the way, is exactly what these polls were off. But the final 3 network polls, CBS, ABC, NBC, I think they all had Hillary by 4, wrong by exactly 4 points. And exactly the kind of voter who was undercounted in the Brexit polls was undercounted in these. But I won't get too much into politics.
I think the only major news organ that got it right was LA Times, right?
Yeah, and that was a very weird poll where they followed the same group of people day to day. It was the people they were polling at the beginning weeks ago were the same people they finished with. And that, I don't know, I guess has pros and cons. Yeah. But in any event, so let me say a little about this from my point of view. I mean, first of all, to look at it from kind of a cosmic perspective.
As you will.
As I am sometimes inclined to do. Okay, so for some time, humankind, you know, globalization has been happening. I mean, in my book, Nonzero, I argued that it had been happening for millennia and millennia in some sense or another. And so social organizations kind of moving in some sense toward the global level, but fitfully at best. People like me would like to think we're moving toward a coherent and even harmonious global community. But in any event, there's certainly aspects of technology seem to be shoving us in that direction, right? And, you know, in retrospect, I think it was inevitable that tensions would arise as a result of globalization, and that several different kinds of tensions that could be described as tribalistic tensions would arise. So, okay, you've got people moving across borders, you've got immigration. So you're going to have some ethnic or national groups feeling that they are threatened in some sense or another by another ethnic group. Perhaps they're threatened in competition for jobs or whatever. You've got... As a result of all the trade, you're going to have some people feeling threatened by national groups, like China is making all this cheap stuff that's putting our workers out of work. So that's a national tribalism. And I think in a way, maybe the most inevitable, I don't know, but I think a big one is you're going to get tension between people who feel they are benefiting from globalization and are happy with it, and profess the values associated with it, cosmopolitanism, diversity, and so on, and the people who feel that they're losing out. And that's going to tend to be a kind of a nationalistic backlash, sometimes with an ethnic tinge. You're seeing that in Brexit. You're seeing that here, I think. So you've got several kinds of what you could call tribal conflict or tension, and that invokes the psychology of tribalism. When one group feels threatened by another group, or you get the psychological mechanisms associated with tribalism. I think they were designed into the brain by natural selection, not actually in a tribalistic conflict context per se. I don't want the word to be taken too literally, but I do think our brains are designed both to engage in cooperative relationships with other people and competitive, even conflictual relationships with other people, with other groups. And as a result, we have all these things in our brains, including cognitive biases, that abet competition or conflict with groups, but in the process can actually distort our vision. And this is one reason, I mean, I think it's probably already clear why I consider this a moral issue. I mean, once you get, you know, ethnic groups and so on viewing each other in a dim light, I think a lot of people would see that there are moral stakes. But I think when you look at how subtly ingrained the psychology of tribalism is, in other words, how hard it is to detach yourself and realize you're not viewing the other group objectively. Sounds easy, but it's not. And I think we all engage in the psychology of tribalism more often than we realize. Once you see how subtly those mechanisms work, I think in some ways transcending them rises to the level of a spiritual challenge, in a loose sense of the term.
Let me just ask you something. I take it that, I mean, part of what characterizes a tribal or tribalistic response is that it's fundamentally not a rational response. That doesn't mean it's an irrational response. It doesn't mean it's crazy, but it's not a rational response. And I guess I just would want to know if you might want to be careful and to maybe disambiguate a few things. I mean, voters, let's say in Michigan or Ohio or Pennsylvania, states that have been whose economies have been hit very hard by a lot of the sort of globalization trends, let's call them, including some of the trade deals we've made. Those aren't non-rational responses, are they? I mean,
no, I would say in general these are not.
That's not tribalism. That you wouldn't call that tribalism, right?
Well, I would say whenever these mechanisms are invoked that distort your view of another group, and this works both ways, okay?
Is it distorted? Is it distorted to think that
when Hillary Clinton looks at the voters who oppose them and says half of them belong in the basket of deplorables without having any evidence that half of them are actually racists, yes, that's a distortion of your vision, and it's just a classic distortion. When a whole group of people is opposed to you, it's not just that you want to think unflattering things about them so you can feel better. No, the logic of natural selection's design of this would be, it is in your interest, when you have rivals or severe competitors, it is in your interest to lower other people's opinion of them. So you come to believe things about them so that you can say the things about them that will lower people's opinion. And in the process, your cognition gets warped. You're not viewing the world clearly.
I only asked you because one of the things you mentioned was people in China producing things cheaply,
right,
and therefore depriving people in the United States, let's say, of jobs. Or of eliminating jobs that used to exist in the United States. I thought that you would cited that as an example, the people who react to that negatively and perhaps voted for Trump because of it, as a tribal reaction. And that doesn't strike me as a tribal reaction. That strikes me as a rational reaction.
Well,
right?
Sure, but to the extent that, I mean, first of all, look, what I'm calling tribal mechanisms, and again, I'm footnote here, I'm not what evolutionary psychologists call much of a group selectionist. I'm not really... I'm not, and besides, by the way, I mean, tribes, as anthropologists use the term, did not exist when the entire world consisted of hunter-gatherer societies. Tribes come with agriculture. Anyway, the context of human evolution was essentially a hunter-gatherer context, and a lot of the competition that shaped the evolution of the brain was just competition with one person and another, maybe one family within a village and another, one coalition within a village and another, sometimes a village against a village, but the point is that in general, the mind is designed to navigate a landscape of both non-zero-sum and zero-sum relationships. The relationship to Chinese workers, for some workers who lost their jobs, is, we can call, with not much oversimplification, a zero-sum relationship. And you're right that perceiving that is not confused. But once you perceive yourself as in opposition to a group, then certain cognitive biases kick in that help you characterize, Right, so I mean, I'll give you an example. I have, my brother voted for Trump. At least one of my sisters did. I'm pretty sure two of my sisters did. I've gotten to be afraid to ask. And the night before the election, I called my brother, and I didn't yet know. I was afraid he was voting for Trump, but I was hoping he would say he wasn't. He was. And he's a smart guy. But when you really, maybe it's unfair to characterize his views, but he had, I think what had happened, this is what I told him, he had come to, first of all, kind of hate the political class, which I think is, in a way, defensible reaction. I don't have a very high opinion of politicians. They're by and large self-serving creeps. And I'm sorry. Maybe that's unfair. I think, maybe all of us would be if we were politicians. We are all, we all try to maintain our status within our career, and maybe that's all they're doing. So fine. But anyway, for him, Hillary had come to represent all that. And his hatred had become focused on her. And I would argue, as I argued with him very intensely, that had completely warped his vision of her, that he was accepting a number of things said about her without really a lot of evidence. Okay? And that almost everything that was being said about her could be said with at least as much evidence about Donald Trump. But anyway, that's an example of, I think, tribal psychology at work. In this case, it was just like the political class is not doing what I think needs to be done. They become the enemy. So it works in all kinds of different directions. And it's worked on both sides. In the whole kind of Trumpism thing, I think there's been, the basket of deplorables remark embodies, represents I think what was initially certainly a very widespread failure to try to look clearly at what was motivating support for Trump. But on the other side of the equation, there's a ton of Trump supporters who they have their own enemies. East Coast elites, so on, and they have a warped vision of them.
I think it's very fair and not at all inaccurate to characterize in a fundamental way this current antipathy between, let's call the cosmopolitans and the quote unquote heartland types as being a fundamentally tribal antipathy at this point. I think that's a fair characterization. Yeah.
Right, and you see it on both sides. The labeling on both sides, and the corresponding. It isn't just like what labels are applied. It's that then you assimilate everything you hear about them in the least generous terms. So one person does something on behalf of them, and you assume it's on behalf of them, right? It's
everything gets interpreted in light of
right.
A frame of reference that you now have.
Right.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
I mean,
the question is, what kind of a problem is it? What kind of problem is that? Is it essentially a problem? I mean, one might say that's sort of the natural state of affairs. That no matter what you do, something is going to sort out that way. So I'm curious to think of what you think. What kind of problem that is?
Well, it is.
That's a problem. What kind of?
It is apocalyptic. This is when I do get religious. I mean,
right.
It is. We're talking about the fate of the world. We're getting. My view is it's not like we have a choice. We can either go to the global level, have a nice global community, or we can just have a whole bunch of nations that have, virtually nothing to do with each other. I just think there are too many non-zero-sum problems that nations can only solve in cooperation, control of weapons of mass destruction, economic.
This is what I'm going to disagree with you on, and so I'm interested to hear. Not interrupting you. I mean, this is sort of the crucial issue. So you think this is apocalyptic? The fact that we're in this situation is apocalyptic, and I think I'm more inclined to say it's inevitable.
Well, okay, but first of all, I mean, leave aside whether we're literally talking about the destruction of the planet. But I mean, it's like, you're right. This has always been part of life. For example, World War I, World War II. Well, wouldn't it be nice to avoid something on that scale again? I mean, yeah, the fact that it's been part of human experience doesn't make me not want to address it. And one thing I would say is that in past periods of history, like before you get to the global level, one thing that keeps societies together is competition from other societies, right? And that creates a sense of non-zero sumness within the society. The fact that there is a zero-sum relationship with the other society. Well, once you start trying to build a global community, you don't have that unless you get invaders from Mars. So it's actually even more challenging than it's been in the past in some ways, and there's actually less grounds for optimism. And that's why I actually think nothing short of a kind of a spiritual revolution is going to do it. Nothing short of people becoming really aware that the human mind is a deeply misleading thing in contexts like this, and it by nature strips you of the kind of intellectual humility that's actually appropriate when you assess other people and groups and ideas.
Yeah. See, I So in traditionally, ethics was always grounded in a conception of the good, of what's valuable, of what matters, right? And right around the 17th and 18th century, that began to change, and more law-oriented notions of ethics emerged. And the reason was precisely because you began to have the emergence, the rise of nation states, that is, larger-scaled communities in which the populations were heterogeneous enough that you could no longer assume that people were going to share a common conception of the good, a common conception of what was valuable. And so you start to develop a notion of obligation, of right, of justice that's independent of any notion of the good. The most famous contemporary version of this is John Rawls' theory of justice. It presumes no common assumption of what is valuable or is good. It begins with a notion of what is just and what is unjust. That a notion that could be accepted from anyone's perspective, right?
Can I just interject? Don't you also see Rawls as a response to the loss of a common religion foundation for morality?
It's the same issue. It's the same issue, because the common religion means you have a common shared conception of the good and what's valuable. Now, to me, what you're describing is a situation in which people don't share a common conception of what's valuable and what's good. And it seems to me that rather than that being a catastrophe, that's the reason for politics, right? I mean, that's why you have to have politics. That's why there needs to be sometimes negotiation. There needs to sometimes be cooperation. There sometimes needs to be confrontation. And I don't see that as being fixable. That to me is a feature, not a bug. And it's the reason why I think that you might want to argue that the nation state was too large of a political unit. I certainly think the idea of a global community is far too large.
But these are not mutually exclusive. I mean, in my book, Nonzero, one thing I emphasize, which I think has certainly been borne out, is that in some ways information technologies encourage the disintegration of nation states. And you're starting to see that in the United States. I mean, you see it in the Scottish independence movement, in the Quebec independence movement. But what I pointed out is that's not incompatible. Organization can simultaneously move to lower and higher levels. When Quebec was thinking about independence, everyone who wanted independence for Quebec said, as soon as we get out of Canada, we're joining NAFTA. And Scotland, well, seriously, I mean, Scotland is saying, look, if England's going to get out, we want to stay in the EU. Some people in Scotland are saying, if we have to get out of of the United Kingdom to get in the EU, we will. So you can have organization. I don't have some kind of simplistic a world government view of this thing.
Yeah, but you spoke of a global community, and I guess I don't believe that there can be any such thing. I'm not even sure I think there can be a national community, as is evinced by our situation and by the fact that you do need politics. Look, if there could be a national community, you wouldn't need formal politics in the way that we have it. And it seems to me that I think that unless you mean something radically different by community, I don't see how there can be a global community.
Well, this is where you get to this becomes the formation of the global community becomes a source of attention. I have twice been to Davos. You know what Davos is, right? This annual gathering of all these corporate CEOs and stuff. Once I was on a panel. Once I covered it for Slate and maybe was also on a panel. I forget, but you realize when you go there, actually there is a global community. There's a community of elites, and that is driven by some of the forces I'm talking about. Technology, economic integration has these people, they get together and they want to do business with each other and they're on the same page. So at the elite level, there actually is more and more of a global community. Now you have times of tension when suddenly Russia's on the outs. Although, interestingly, they may be less so in a Trump presidency. But in any event, even so, you see, China sends people to Davos. And this kind of thing wasn't happening 150 years ago. Even though it, in principle, could have. You could have gathered people, in one place. And it's happening every year. It's happening all the time, technologically. There is a growing global community of elites. This is a source of the tension. The sense in the heartland that they're being left behind by this club of elites who hold them with either disregard or in contempt.
Right.
And And
but notice something about, I mean, I agree with you that there are global communities in the sense that there are transnational communities of people. But notice that those are all communities of shared common interests and values, right? In other words, there's a global ecological community. There's a global feminist community. There's a global, like you say, plutocrat community. But what I'm denying is that you could have a global community in the way that you, let's say, have, you know, a local community, right? You couldn't have, and it almost sounds to me like what you're trying to imagine is a world in which there's no need anymore for politics.
No, quite the opposite. Some of what I'm talking about is politics. I mean, remember, the European Union was called the European Community before it was called the European Union. It's not like one was political and one wasn't. I mean, the word community is a broad term, and I would say one thing I'm talking about, when you say, could it really be the whole globe? I'm saying, along certain dimensions, if it's not, it's going to get apocalyptic. Let me just give you one example. You know, when we think of weapons of mass destruction, people mainly think of nukes. They are a problem. But a more challenging problem is the fact that we're getting to a point where a smart college kid in a half-decent lab can, in principle, engineer a biological organism that will kill everyone in the world. Now, if that can be done in any lab or in a lab in any country, I think you're going to have to, within the next 20, 30 years, have a legal framework that every nation is signed on to, that has some degree of monitoring and so on, or I think things are going to look very bad. Now, I would call that part of a global community and really signing on to, in a certain sense, a set of values that, yeah, we all think this is important enough to set up a policing structure.
Look, I don't disagree that maybe we could have, if what you mean by a global community is a shorthand for many small global communities along various vectors, right?
Yeah, various dimensions of integration.
I probably agree with that. When I said that you're imagining a world without politics, what I mean is something like this. I mean, there's two meanings to the word politics. There's politics in antiquity, in which what politics was a group of people with a shared vision of the good figuring out how to flourish together, right? But politics in the modern era is basically the science of how people who really don't like each other very much can nonetheless live together. And if what you mean by a global community is a world in which, at a global scale, we all kind of like each other and get along.
No.
That's just completely
no. But we have to have and honor common values, at least in the sense of all of us believing that the survival of the world is a good thing, that widespread violence is a bad thing, that and perhaps in acknowledging that the survival of the world as a practical matter does require some minimal level of equality in various senses. That if you have any group of people anywhere that feels massively disrespected or alienated, you've got trouble. So, you know, I think some degree of shared values is part of this. I don't mean every single person signs on to them, but I mean they are values that are, you know, honored on a pretty widespread basis in every nation, ultimately. As unrealistic as that seems now, I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying I really think in the longest run it's the only alternative to chaos.
You think it had better happen?
Yeah, it's the only alternative to chaos. And so this challenge that Trumpism is a response to was in some sense inevitable. And you know, maybe it's better that, I mean, look, I'm still recovering from the shock because here's one thing, you know, I've been talking about what was inevitable, what was in the cards, but there's historical contingency. It was not inevitable that the person who represents this movement in the United States was such a horrible person, in my view. Like, that it would be somebody who makes fun of disabled people. That it would be somebody who so instinctively appeals to the worst part of human nature.
So
vulgar. So he's just done so much to degrade political and cultural discourse. That was not inevitable. So, you know, in a way, it's not great that he's the guy. But at some point, you had to confront these issues.
Can I ask you something about that, though? Just because I actually was having this conversation with somebody else. Is it so much that Trump is that guy, or that we know he's that guy? And let me get you what I'm meaning. It turns out Nixon was like that. It's just that we didn't know it until we heard his private tapes. It turns out that LBJ was like that.
Well,
except that we didn't know it until later. In other words,
right? But
there's a publicness to this, an overtness to this, and I'm wondering whether it's that the people are actually such terrible people, or that it's that we know that they're such
okay. But there's two separate things. There's the new transparency, the new retrospective transparency, where suddenly a tape of something he said 10 years ago surfaces. An email written about Hillary Clinton 2 years ago surfaces. I mean, so much of the turbulence in this campaign was about the new transparency. There's that.
Yeah.
But there's also the fact that Donald Trump chooses to speak in public the way Nixon spoke in private. Yeah. That's just Donald Trump.
Right.
None of the other Republican candidates...
It's the Times, too.
It is, but none of the other Republican candidates were making fun of each other's appearance like out of the box until Trump started doing it. He's taken this to a new level.
Maybe not quite. Remember B1 Bob Dornan? Remember? I mean, there were some guys who would say some pretty awful things in public, but you're right. I mean, I think.
Oh, he's just off the charts.
Yeah,
he's a horrible, horrible person.
Yeah. He's the vulgarity,
and just the instinct to respond to any kind of threat with immediately hitting below the belt.
Vicious kind of. Yeah.
Just immediately.
Yeah.
But anyway, no point in going on and on. It's another reason I consider this election a moral issue. And it's, that's the thing is, it's the reason I'm so disappointed in my siblings. I mean, it's like, it isn't the set of issues he represents. That it is, it isn't as incoherent as his platform actually is. When you look at it, it's not that they signed on to the platform. Right. It's that they didn't just go, wait, at some point, you just got to say no to this human being,
Right. In other words, if your sibling had been an auto worker who lost his job in Flint, Michigan, you might not have been as upset about his voting for Trump.
I'd still be disappointed. I mean, look, one of my sisters who voted for Trump, for her, she's an evangelical Christian, and for her, abortion is a huge issue, and she wants the next Supreme Court justice to be chosen by a Republican, and that's the big motivating issue. And I don't doubt that for her, that is felt as intensely and morally as the feeling of a auto worker in Flint, right? I mean, I'm not. Who am I to say whose motivation?
So that's not so much disappointing. It's more that you just have a fundamental disagreement about something, right, with her.
Yeah,
right?
No, but what I'm saying is, it just seems to me, I would have just thought, given what I know about my family and the values I thought were infused in it by my parents, who are not around to testify, so we can't ask them who they would vote for. But I would have just thought that, wait, you make fun of disabled people? That's just off the table. I mean, that would have been my hope. But at the same time, look, I mean, I am in the throes of tribal psychology myself. I mean, part of my sermon is we should all be skeptical of our own judgments, and really examine them. So,
but on the subject of morals and mores, I mean, it is quite interesting. I mean, aside from talking about Trump's vulgarity as a way to sort of bash on him and as a reason for finding him revolting, it did strike me throughout the election that no matter how bad a thing he would say, it wouldn't hurt him.
Right.
If anything, actually, he seemed to do better with each bad thing that he said.
He certainly survived them.
And I almost wonder whether, what you think about that. I mean,
well,
I mean, go ahead. Yeah,
I think there's two issues. I think a lot of that was a feature, not a bug, because people like my brother in particular feel that they're at war with the political class. And when he said things that a politician wouldn't say, that just proved that he was their guy. My brother actually said, I want to throw a wrench into the works. They want to send a guy to Washington who's not a politician. Now, we're already seeing, I mean, it's interesting. We're taping this on Friday. The election was Tuesday. We are seeing the Republican establishment take him over, if you ask me.
Right, he's already talking nicer.
He said he said that, you know, one thing about Obamacare that might be worth preserving is that you can't discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions. Well, buddy, once you bought into that, you're going to find yourself buying into a whole lot of stuff you don't understand yet. Yeah. And it's going to wind up looking in some kind of normative sense like Obamacare. But anyway, what I was going to say was, so there is that. It's a feature, not a bug. And then there's the things that they're willing to overlook. When I brought up the disabled person, my brother said, yeah, I struggled with that. So that's not, that. I don't think many people considered that a feature. And I think there are things he said, and my sister certainly didn't consider the tape that was discovered of him talking about women that way a feature. I mean, I saw how she handled it on Facebook and whatever, but so I think there's two kinds of things. There's the kinds of things he said that were taken as affirmation that he's exactly the guy that's sent to Washington to blow it up. And then I think most supporters probably had things he said that they really didn't identify with but were willing to forgive because they were so intensely motivated.
Do you think, I mean, do you give any credence at all to the idea that maybe we just pushed a little too far, a little too fast, and a little too hard with a certain kind of public moralizing that people just got sick and tired of? And that the reaction was sort of to just sort of blow raspberries at everybody, so to speak. Because I know that even I mean, I'm a liberal. I'm more of a classical liberal, not a progressive. But I just started getting really sick to death of hearing all the time the things I couldn't say, the things I could say, what I had to call people, what I wasn't allowed to call people. And it would be literally from week to week. Well, this week you can call them this, but this week you can't call them this anymore. And, you know, if they want to be called this, you better call them this or else you're going to get in trouble. And do you think that people just, that there was a kind of really overbearing, heavy-handed moralizing going on at the very superficial level of people's just sort of affect that a lot of people just got sick and tired of and just sort of did this in reaction to? Trump is like a giant sort of...
Oh, I think that definitely was part of what was going on. I mean, it's been part of Howard Stern's popularity for decades. There have been people who were already back then, you know, 20, 25 years ago, frustrated with the, like, things, you know, you used to say about women in the locker room, and now you're not, you know, and there's definitely been that. And I think that's why, you know, when he said this is just locker room talk, it probably, some people probably considered that a feature. I don't know. But I think there's no doubt that the political correctness got on people's nerves, and I think it interacted, some of it interacted with their actual economic grievances. So if they perceive a threat to their job from Mexicans coming across the border, or they think that affirmative action gives an African American an unfair advantage over their kid getting into college, and then you start saying, oh, and by the way, every week we're going to change the proper term by which you know, the term by which you are allowed to refer to the people you find threatening. Obviously, I mean, obviously every week's an exaggeration, and in fact, those particular terms only change about once every 15 years, actually. But there's an interaction between the speech code issue and the actual perceived economic issues.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm asking sort of a little bit is, do you think that there's a lesson for, I mean, those of us who are liberals and progressives and who do want to see sort of progress in these areas that we view as moral, I mean, do you think that there's a lesson for us as to what are sort of wise ways to pursue this and what are sort of unwise ways to pursue this, right? Because it seems to me that we've been focusing on a lot of what I would take to be trivia that actually wound up hurting the causes more than helping them, right? I mean, by creating backlash, even in people, if someone like me is reacting that way, and I don't need to be convinced, right? Yeah. How is somebody who's on the fence? Look, the hardcore racists and the troglodytes, they're never going to be convinced. But Trump couldn't have won an election with nothing but hardcore racists and troglodytes, right? He had to win people who were sort of, you know, basically decent folk, but maybe, you know, they're not up on the latest lingo. And I'm just wondering whether there's a lesson to us how maybe the smart way to go about this and what maybe not such a smart way to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging. I mean, all societies have speech codes, and this is one thing I want to say to the anti PC crowd is, look, all societies have speech codes. I think they serve a purpose. It's possible for them to become too expansive, yes, but let's just start with basics. I think the prohibition on the N-word in a country that, that had slavery and then Jim Crow and so on played a valuable role, and I think it still plays a valuable role. So at some level, I think you need speech codes. Is it possible that we've gone too far? It is possible. It's a very challenging issue. And look, you teach at a college level. I teach every once in a while at a college level. And so I think both of us feel this a little more, because in colleges right now, the PC thing is, you do find yourself in class stopping in mid-sentence, going, what's the proper term, and so on. All that said, I don't know what it's like to be transgender. And in fact, that's one thing that's kind of like the most far from my experience, right? It's kind of like easier for me to imagine myself being Latino, Black, Jewish, I think. But even there, I really don't know, because I don't see the encounters of a black person with racism, of a Jew with anti-Semitism. I tend not to witness those. I don't think I've just led a charmed life. I think it's just that those, it's like there's not so much of it that you see. It's out there on the street all the time. But if you grow up with an identity like this, you're bound to encounter it. And, I would think being gay, 15 years ago must have been excruciating. And certainly it's a good thing that it's become less so. And so I don't know, where do you wind up drawing the, I don't know. I mean, do I suspect that that only 2 years after most people even became aware that transgender was a real thing, in a certain sense, right? Yeah. Because I think until Caitlyn Jenner, I mean, honestly, it was almost like, for most people, it was like hearing about unicorns or something, right? Because
there had been cases before. I mean, there was a relatively high-profile case in the 70s with Renee Richards, the tennis player.
Yeah.
But, unless you were paying attention to tennis, and I mean, tennis was much bigger in the 70s than it is now, it's something you wouldn't have even noticed. And there was, there was Sonny and there was Sonny Bono's child. There were a few people that took. But you're right. I mean, the Caitlyn Jenner was huge.
That put it on the front page.
Yeah.
And then so is it possible that before you raise the public bathroom issue, it'd be better to wait a few years? Yeah, that's possible. And I certainly think that this is a thing. I mean, where was it? North Carolina, where like the NCAA and various places said we're going to cancel our event because of your bathroom laws or something, because of this thing you passed against transgender rights.
Yeah, and rock bands saying that they're not going to go play in these states and making these big public displays. And I actually think that all that's counterproductive.
Well, in any event, I would say it probably helped Trump. I think it's part of what we're talking about. And, pacing, there is such a thing as...
pacing has to be very careful.
But it's hard for me to complain that it's too fast when I'm not one of the victims,
Well, I'm never going to call myself a victim, but I am a Jewish person in a 99% evangelical Christian area. My daughter is one of 2 Jewish kids in the entire school that she goes to. And, I recognize very well that, there's just certain things that, to acculturate this community in such a way that they are never going to be insensitive to my daughter and never say anything that she's not going to like and never put up a display that she's going to wish she didn't have to look at every 5 seconds is probably unrealistic. And I mean, I have to battle with myself a sort of an inclination to go and fight these people to the death every 5 minutes and to get lawyers and to use all sorts of. But I think in the end it actually wouldn't help. It would make things worse. That they've got to, in a sense, become acculturated, and eventually they will. This area is going to get more and more diverse. It's just a fact of life, and I guess it's a question, and this gets back to politics and morals again. You can be right about something, and yet that's not necessarily the best thing to do, right? And I wonder whether a good part, or at least a part of the Trump thing, is because we got too confident in the Obama days, and we pushed too fast and too hard, and we were a bit too insulting and a bit too dismissive. When the gay marriage thing went through, remember the gay marriage thing went through, and this clerk in Kentucky refused to certify it, refused to certify somebody's wedding. I just felt like the mocking and the humiliation of this woman that sort of took place, even if it was justified morally, was strategically a terrible mistake if what you were trying to do was to improve the lot of gay people in rural Kentucky, right?
Yeah, no, as a legal matter, look, you either enforce the law or you resign. I mean, that's my position on the clerk, but
it's social and moral.
Right, but no, I know what you mean. And you wrote about this. You wrote your own thing on Trumpism on the electric, the electric blank. And so, you know, people can look there for your take on this. I'm curious, do you think, I mean, speaking of anti-Semitism, and I'm not, first of all, are you talking about anti-Semitism in your community or just a kind of a naive insensitivity to the presence of people outside of your tradition?
In my own in the case of my daughter, it's been entirely, it's been 90% naive insensitivity. It's been a small amount of institutional insensitivity. There's been a small amount, I mean, she's had a few, I can't be friends with you because you're not a Christian. At a very young age. She had that said to her when she was 10 years old.
Man, I do live in a bubble because that kind of thing is so alien to my experience now.
Personally, you know, at the university I've had very little because, you know, the university is the one place where there actually are some Jewish people, at least faculty. But one thing that was said to me very early on that I'll never forget, and it was actually said to me by the wife of my former department head when we first came here, and we went to their house for dinner. And I was talking about the house and how nice it was and asked them, you know, how they went about getting it, because obviously that was something we were interested in having moved to the area. And his wife said to me, described how they had met with the owner, and she said, and after we Jewed him down a little, we got it for X number of dollars. And I remember afterwards we walked out and my wife said to me, what kind of place have you and I moved to?
But you know what's funny is, like, sometimes you, like, that's a term I heard when I was about 8, living in El Paso, Texas. And it was only in the context of going over to Juarez, Mexico, where you would bargain with merchants. You didn't bargain with merchants in El Paso. And you'd hear that term about bargaining with merchants. And I didn't even know, I just, you know, I didn't even think, I didn't know what a Jew was. Jew was just a verb to me in that context at that point. And it's, there's actually another related anecdote in the sense of my slowly becoming aware of Jewishness and cultural insensitivity. So when I was in 5th grade, in violation of the what must have been the law after the Madalyn Murray O'Hair ruling, right? The teacher would lead us in the Lord's Prayer every morning in a public school. It was on an army base, but it was a public school. And first of all, she used to complain. She once heard somebody, like, saying the last line wrong, and she got so upset. Well, it turned out they were, like, doing the Catholic version. So that's one kind of insensitivity. But the other thing is, when you grow up on an army base and you move from base to base, you every once in a while encounter kids that you've known elsewhere. So in high school, on Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, I met a girl who had been in my class, Fort Monroe. And that was when I first realized she was Jewish. Her name was Weiss. In 5th grade, I hadn't known she was Jewish, but looking back, I'm like, whoa, what was that like for her? Reciting the Lord's Prayer every morning and some teacher screaming at you if you say it wrong.
Yeah.
But she didn't, you know, they didn't raise it as an issue. Her parents didn't raise it as an issue.
So no, it's mostly naive insensitivity, and it's this sense. I don't know how to explain this. I've said this to people in discussions, actually on Blogging Heads and other videos. It's this overwhelming sense that Christianity is normative, that my daughter has. When she was young, she used to come and tell me that she wished she wasn't Jewish. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't because people were being overtly anti-Semitic to her. It's because everything being directed at her was that Christianity was normative. Yeah. And for kids, the worst thing that you can be is to not belong or to be left out.
But see, meanwhile, Christians...
because you're...
You just froze up a little bit.
Yeah, we both did. One of us froze.
But I was just going to say, I mean, some Christians now feel that same thing. They feel that...
That's right.
That when they look around, like my sister was a homeschooler.
Right.
And it's... because she doesn't live in a small Midwestern town where everyone is going to have the same, the same religious where almost everyone's going to have the same religious background. And the perception of a lot of, Christians, of course, is that, modern secular culture, which is associated with these cosmopolitans. And this probably is one thing that made it easy for evangelicals to kind of bite the bullet and go with Trump.
Yeah.
Because they feel alienated from, at least evangelicals feel alienated from some of the values associated with the cosmopolitan community that he was doing battle with implicitly.
And this goes back to the tribalism point you made at the very beginning, right? I mean, it's just, the evangelical who finds himself in living in the Bay Area probably feels similar way to the way that we feel living here in the Bible Belt, right?
Yeah, well, an evangelical living in a Republican living in my town. I mean, there's one known to be Republican household in this vicinity. They had Bush bumper stickers, drive huge SUVs instead of Priuses.
Letter on their door.
It's, and this is a thing, the growing demographic segregation. There was a book called The Big Sort, I think, by a guy named Bishop.
Yeah.
About this fact, and so it's hard times, but I don't know. I mean, getting back to this, I'm trying to formulate a set of these 60-second sermons. It's hard to.
What are you going to talk about? I mean, what is it that you want to talk about in yours? I don't want you to give it away, but
no, I don't know. I mean, it's one thing to think that many of these problems would go away if everybody were much better at putting themselves in the shoes of the people on the other side of the line, just in the sense of understanding their perspective, which is a core belief of mine, so-called moral imagination.
Yeah.
It's one thing to believe that, and another thing to convince people to try.
To affect it. How do you affect that? I mean,
yeah.
How do you... And my view is always, all you can do is start out yourself, right? I can't control other people, but I don't have to go and humiliate and shame that person. I can, even if I think they're totally wrong, even if I think they're awful, I can recognize at some point, they have a vote too, and it's not going to go away, even if they're wrong and they're awful. And I either have to convince them, or I have to work with them somehow, or I have to, but I think there's almost this feeling now. It's like, well, if I'm right and I can prove it, then somehow the other person disappears, and that's not how politics works. I mean, as we found out, right? I mean, this election, that's not how politics works.
Yeah, and one reason it's challenging to evince a kind of humility, and I see myself illustrating the challenge and failing to surmount it on Twitter, is that, as I said, I do believe Donald Trump is, they deserve better. I mean, his followers deserve better. And I find myself on Twitter saying things about him. Like my last tweet was about this thing. I read this Wall Street Journal piece where they said, do you think that some of your rhetoric during the campaign went too far? And he said, no, I won. And that's just like classic Trump. So I tweeted it and I ridiculed it, and come on, it deserves it. But at the same time, that his followers on Twitter are probably seeing that as contempt for the entire group, right?
Yeah.
So
I think it's more. I think it's less bad to ridicule Trump than to ridicule.
Well, that's my rule of thumb.
Than to ridicule voters.
Oh, absolutely. My rule of thumb is. Again, I deplore Hillary's basket of deplorables remark. The sheer stupidity of it is
so
mind-boggling.
And just.
But anyway, it's a challenge, and I haven't totally figured it out. So anyway, people can stay tuned and see what kinds of sermons I.
When are you going to launch this feature, Bob?
People can upload a sermon now. They can go to that page.
Oh, the link's already up?
The upload page is up. It hasn't been used much, but it's up. It just went up.
Maybe you should put a link in this dialogue so that, because if it's not obvious on the main page...
Yeah, maybe we'll put it in the links mentioned section of this dialogue. And they'll see on that page some, you know, kind of guidelines, just some ideas about what kinds of things. And they'll see that technically we're going to let them go as long as 89 seconds. In other words, if they're closer to 1 minute than 2 minutes, fine. But after that, they're too long.
And are you providing the recorder, or are they filming it themselves and uploading an AVI or an MPEG or a...
We, at first, I mean, we have a kind of online recorder, but then we realized most people are not going to want to like the idea that whatever they're taping is being uploaded as they speak. People are going to want to do more than one take, maybe. They're going to want to have something they're satisfied with and then upload that. So, you know, pretty much every computer has a client. QuickTime in Mac, it's more complicated with Windows because it depends on the version of Windows you got. But we have a link to a free online recorder that you can use to to record something to your desktop that you would then upload.
Excellent.
So
as soon as people start uploading, you're going to start posting. They're going to start appearing.
Well, we're probably going to gather a number of them and continue to refine our idea about how to present them. But yeah, we're not going to wait long once we have a fair number. I'm hoping I'm going to record one this weekend, so we'll have that. And
great. Well, I look forward to seeing that, Bob.
Yeah, me too. We'll see, and we encourage people to share ones that they like. And there will be a comments section. You can comment on them. Please be nice. These are people, you know, people uploading this. They're putting their heart and soul out there in some cases.
Try not to trash people's videos.
Yeah, in keeping with much of what we've been saying about kind of intellectual humility and civility.
And what about the YouTube conversion? When is Blogging Heads going to go to that platform?
That's a good question. We're still fiddling with the meaning of life version. We made one significant change already in how we do that. Assessing, you know, I don't have an exact answer. In certain ways, it makes more sense for meaning of life, but ultimately, I think we need to do it for Blogging Heads as well because it makes certain things easier.
Yeah.
So I would guess. If I had to guess, I would say, you know, 1 to 2 months, which I think is what I said a month ago. But still.
Well, all right, Bob.
Okay. Anything else you want to say about Trumpism?
No, I think this was a good conversation. We'll let others do the pure politics of it.
Yeah.
And as I'm sure they will, there's already been a couple, and I'm sure you've got more on deck. So
yeah.
But yeah, no, great. This was great. Thank you so much.
And you know, people should watch your show, Sophia. I think you've got another one with Massimo.
Massimo and I are going to film on Monday. We're doing something on ancient versus modern philosophy, and in what sense modern philosophy is an improvement over ancient, and in what ways it isn't an improvement over ancient philosophy. And it'll be a welcome reprieve from people who are sick and tired of the election, and I will not allow Massimo to bring it up. So I'm sure he'll want to, because he's more liberal than I am, and he's probably frothing about it right now. So
okay, I'm with him. I'm with him on that. Okay, well, thanks, Dan, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Bob. Talk to you soon.
Okay.